James Walker had always dreamed of living somewhere peaceful, a place where he could come home after long, stressful days at work and feel like he was stepping into a little piece of heaven. After years of saving, budgeting, and planning, that dream finally came true when he moved into Lakeside Estates, a quiet, picturesque neighborhood surrounded by trees, winding paths, and a beautiful sparkling lake right at its heart. From the very first day, James felt something magical about that lake. It wasn't just the way the sunlight danced on the surface in the mornings or how the soft ripples glowed like liquid gold during sunsets, it was the calmness it gave him. Fishing had always been James's favorite escape. As a child, his grandfather used to take him to small ponds and rivers back in their hometown. Those early mornings spent by the water, holding a fishing rod, waiting for the first little tug, they were some of his happiest memories. So naturally, when James saw that the community had a private lake, it felt like fate. For the first few months, everything seemed perfect. James would wake up early on weekends, pack a small cooler with snacks, grab his fishing rod, and head to the lake. Most days, there was hardly anyone else around. Sometimes, a few neighbors would pass by, wave, and make small talk. Occasionally, kids would ride their bikes nearby, laughing and shouting joyfully as their parents strolled along the walking paths. To James, it felt like this was exactly what he had been working so hard for: a home, a peaceful community, and a place where he could enjoy the simple pleasures of life. He was proud of where he lived. But slowly, he began to notice something strange. At first, it was subtle: the looks. Some neighbors would glance at him a little longer than necessary when he was fishing. Sometimes, he'd hear hushed whispers as people walked past. A few of them never returned his friendly greetings. James didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were just reserved people, he thought. Maybe they were like him when he first moved in, shy and still adjusting. One Saturday morning, James set up his usual spot by the lake. The air was crisp, and a gentle breeze rippled across the water. It was the kind of morning where everything just felt right. As he cast his line, he noticed a small group of neighbors a little distance away, pointing toward him and talking among themselves. He waved and smiled, but they didn't respond. Shrugging it off, James focused on fishing. For the next couple of hours, he enjoyed the peace and quiet, lost in thought, until he was startled by a sharp voice behind him. "Excuse me," a woman said, her tone firm. "Are you allowed to fish here?" James turned around to see a middle-aged woman with neatly combed hair and a clipboard in her hand. Her name tag read Karen Willis, HOA board member. "Yes," James replied politely. "When I bought my house, they told me the lake was part of the community amenities. It's one of the reasons I moved here." She frowned, glancing at his cooler and fishing rod. "Well, this area is for residents only." "I am a resident," James said calmly, pulling out his keycard from his pocket. "I live just down the street." Her expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. Well, I'll have to check the updated rules. The HOA's been making changes lately. I'll let you know." Without another word, she walked away. James was left puzzled but didn't think much of it at the time. After all, he'd been fishing there for months without any issue. Surely, there couldn't be a problem now. But a week later, an envelope showed up in his mailbox. Inside was an official-looking letter from the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. "Dear Mr. Walker, you are hereby notified that you are in violation of HOA rules regarding unauthorized fishing in the community lake. A fine of $250 has been applied to your account. Please remit payment within 14 days to avoid further penalties." James reread the letter several times, confused and frustrated. How could fishing in the community lake, something advertised as a resident benefit, be unauthorized? He checked his property documents and HOA guidelines. Sure enough, it was right there in black and white: residents had access to the lake and could fish recreationally, as long as they followed basic safety rules. He had never broken any of them. The next day, he called the HOA office. "Hi, this is James Walker, homeowner on Oak Ridge Drive," he began, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I just got a fine for fishing, but according to the community rules I received when I moved in, fishing is allowed. Could you clarify this for me?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a curt response from the HOA representative. "Mr. Walker, the HOA has implemented new restrictions. Fishing is now limited to certain areas, and access is granted only with prior approval." "That's strange," James replied, "because I haven't received any notice about these changes. And I was fishing in the same spot I always have." "Well," the representative said flatly, "if you'd like to dispute the fine, you can bring it up at the next HOA meeting." And so, James marked the date on his calendar. For the next few days, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He spoke with a few neighbors, casually asking if they knew about these so-called new rules. Some said they hadn't heard anything at all. Others admitted they'd received notices but were still confused. When the HOA meeting finally came around, James showed up early. The community clubhouse was buzzing with chatter, homeowners filling the rows of chairs. At the front, the board members sat behind a long table, papers neatly stacked in front of them. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood up, holding his property documents in hand. "I've been fined for fishing in the lake," he said, projecting his voice clearly. "But according to the rules I received when I moved in, fishing is permitted for residents. I'd like to know why this fine was issued." Karen Willis, the same board member who confronted him by the lake, leaned forward and spoke into the microphone. "Mr. Walker, the HOA has decided to update the community guidelines to better preserve the lake. Fishing privileges have been restricted, and residents must now request permission before engaging in any fishing activities." James frowned. "But I wasn't informed of any of this. When were these changes made?" Karen shifted uncomfortably. "The updates are recent. Notices were sent out." "I never received one," James countered. "And I've spoken to several neighbors who haven't either. If you're enforcing a fine based on rules no one was properly notified about, that doesn't seem fair." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some residents nodded in agreement, others whispered among themselves. Karen's lips tightened, but she didn't back down. "Mr. Walker, the rules are the rules. The fine stands unless you can provide written proof that you were explicitly granted fishing rights." James held up his deed. "I can. It's right here." The board exchanged uneasy glances. Clearly, they hadn't expected him to come prepared. Still, they refused to rescind the fine on the spot, insisting they'd review the matter further. As James walked out of the meeting that night, a mix of frustration and determination burned inside him. Something about this didn't feel like a simple misunderstanding. He loved this community. He loved that lake. And he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him without a fair fight. James tried to push the whole incident out of his mind, but the fine letter kept nagging at him. Every time he walked past the lake, he felt a mix of frustration and sadness. It used to be his place of peace, a quiet retreat where the world slowed down, but now, every time he saw it, he was reminded of the unnecessary conflict. He decided to stay away from the water for a couple of weeks, thinking it might ease the tension. Maybe the HOA would come to its senses. Maybe someone on the board would realize the rule change wasn't fair. But as time passed, nothing changed. One morning, James sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee, when he saw another envelope from the HOA in his mailbox. His heart sank. Inside was a reminder notice: "Your outstanding fine of $250 remains unpaid. Additional penalties may be applied if the amount is not cleared within 7 days." James sighed deeply. He had already explained his case during the meeting. He had shown them his deed and the original guidelines. He had done everything by the book. Yet, they were treating him as if he was breaking the rules deliberately. He decided to visit the HOA office in person this time. The office was located at the far end of the community, inside a small brick building. When James walked in, he was greeted by a receptionist seated behind a wooden desk. She smiled politely but looked a little nervous when he explained why he was there. "I need to speak to someone about this fishing fine," James said, holding up the letter. "Of course," she replied softly. "One moment." She disappeared into the back and returned a few minutes later with Karen Willis, the same board member who had confronted him by the lake weeks earlier. "Mr. Walker," she said in a practiced, polite tone. "I assume this is about the fine." "Yes," James replied, keeping his voice calm. "I've already shown my deed and the HOA's original guidelines. Fishing was listed as a resident amenity when I purchased my property. I don't understand why I'm being penalized." Karen folded her arms and gave a rehearsed explanation. "The board has implemented new regulations to preserve the lake's ecosystem. We're limiting fishing access to approved residents only, and you need prior written permission to fish there now." James blinked, trying to process her words. "Approved residents? What does that even mean? Isn't everyone who lives here a resident?" Karen hesitated but didn't answer directly. "The board decides access based on environmental factors." James leaned forward slightly. "Then why wasn't anyone notified properly about these changes? I've spoken to several neighbors who didn't receive any notices either. It feels like these rules were made quietly and applied selectively." Karen's polite smile faded. "Mr. Walker, I understand your frustration, but the board has the authority to make these decisions. If you disagree, you can formally appeal, though I must warn you, appeals rarely overturn board rulings." James left the office that day feeling more unsettled than ever. Something about this didn't sit right. The rules had been changed suddenly, and now there was a vague approval system no one seemed to understand. Later that week, James decided to knock on a few doors and talk to his neighbors. First, he visited Mr. Peterson, an elderly man who lived 2 streets over. "I've been fishing here for 15 years, Mr. Peterson said with a sigh. "I used to take my grandson out there every summer. But last month, I got a letter saying I couldn't anymore unless I applied for special access. I tried calling, but no one returned my calls." James thanked him and moved on to another neighbor, a young couple named Sarah and David. They told him they had also received a warning letter after walking near the lake with fishing poles, even though they hadn't even started fishing. It became clear that he wasn't the only one affected, but oddly enough, some residents still seemed to have full access without restrictions. A pattern was forming, one James couldn't ignore. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. This time, James came prepared. He brought his property deed, the HOA's original rules, and a list of signatures from more than 20 residents who also believed the new restrictions were unfair. When his turn came to speak, he stood in front of the crowded room and addressed the board. "With all due respect," James began, "these new fishing restrictions are unclear, inconsistently enforced, and were implemented without proper communication. The original HOA guidelines specifically state that residents have lake access for recreational activities, including fishing. Many of us bought our homes based on these advertised amenities. Changing the rules without notifying us properly isn't just wrong, it feels misleading." The murmurs in the audience grew louder. Several residents nodded and whispered in agreement. Karen, sitting in the center of the board table, adjusted her microphone. "Mr. Walker, we've explained before, the restrictions are for the preservation of the lake. This isn't personal." James stayed calm. "Then why do some residents still have unrestricted access? I've spoken to several neighbors who've been warned or fined, yet others fish freely without any issues. If this isn't personal, then why isn't the rule being applied equally?" The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Before anyone could respond, an older gentleman named Mr. Hayes, another board member, cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker, perhaps the board should revisit this matter before making any final decisions." Karen's expression stiffened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she announced that the discussion would be tabled for further review. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. Over the next few days, James tried to stay patient, but the HOA remained silent. No updates, no letters, no decisions. Then, one Friday afternoon, he returned home from work to find yet another envelope waiting in his mailbox. He tore it open, half expecting an update about the rules. Instead, he found a second fine, this one for $500, citing continued violation of unauthorized fishing regulations. James was stunned. He hadn't even gone near the lake since the first fine. How could they accuse him again? He called the HOA immediately. "I haven't been fishing," he said firmly. "This second fine is a mistake." The representative on the phone replied coolly, "Mr. Walker, according to our records, your property is flagged for repeated violations. If you'd like to dispute the charges, you can do so at the next meeting." James hung up, his frustration mounting. It wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about fairness. It was about principle. That weekend, he spent hours researching the lake, the HOA's authority, and property rights. What he discovered surprised him: the HOA didn't actually own the lake. The water body was technically part of a private trust managed separately from the homeowners association. It was a small detail most residents didn't know, and one the HOA seemed to conveniently ignore. James realized he had an opportunity. If the HOA didn't own the lake, then maybe, just maybe, there was a way to take control of the situation once and for all. But before making any moves, he needed to be absolutely sure. He set up a meeting with the local records office and confirmed everything. The trust that held ownership of the lake had been struggling financially for years and was open to selling. James left the office that day with a quiet determination. He didn't share his discovery with anyone, not even his closest neighbors. If the HOA wanted to push him out of the lake, they had no idea what was coming next. James couldn't stop thinking about what he had discovered. The fact that the HOA didn't actually own the lake changed everything. For months, they had acted as if they controlled the water, threatening fines, imposing restrictions, and deciding who could and couldn't fish. But in reality, the lake belonged to a separate trust, one that, as James now knew, was struggling financially. That night, James sat at his desk, staring at the documents he had collected. He had copies of the original HOA guidelines, his property deed, and now, the official records confirming the lake's ownership. The information was like a secret weapon, but he didn't want to rush into anything. He leaned back in his chair, thinking about everything that had happened over the past few months: the unexpected fines, the letters, the dismissive tone at the HOA meetings, and the quiet frustration of his neighbors. He thought about Mr. Peterson, who could no longer fish with his grandson, and Sarah and David, who had been warned for simply walking near the water. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone in the community who had been treated unfairly. Over the next week, James spent every spare moment researching. He dug into public property records, spoke to a few real estate experts, and even called the trust's administrative office anonymously to learn more. That's when he discovered something important: the trust had been considering selling the lake for years. Maintenance costs were high, and they didn't have enough funds to keep up with the expenses. James saw an opportunity. If he could purchase the rights to the lake, he wouldn't just protect his fishing hobby, he would take control of the very thing the HOA had been using to pressure residents. But it wouldn't be easy. It wasn't a small purchase, and he would need to plan carefully. One evening, James invited a few trusted neighbors over to his house. Around the dining table sat Mr. Peterson, Sarah, and David, and a retired schoolteacher named Linda, who had also been fined recently. James spread out the documents on the table and explained everything he had learned. At first, They were shocked. "You're saying the HOA doesn't even own the lake?" Linda asked, adjusting her glasses in disbelief. "That's right," James said calmly. "It belongs to a private trust. And the trust is considering selling it." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes wide. "So, if someone else bought it, they'd decide the rules?" James nodded. "Exactly. And if we play this right, that someone could be me." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone processed what he had just said. David finally spoke up. "That's bold, James. But it could work. If you owned the lake, the HOA wouldn't have any authority over it anymore." Mr. Peterson chuckled softly. "Imagine the look on their faces when they realize they've been enforcing rules they don't have the right to make." The group discussed the possibilities late into the night. Some were skeptical, worried about the costs and legalities, while others were excited by the idea of finally having some control back. In the end, they agreed to support James if he decided to move forward. The next day, James contacted the trust directly. He introduced himself, explained that he was a resident of Lakeside Estates, and expressed interest in purchasing the lake. To his surprise, the trust administrator was open to talking. "We've had a few inquiries over the years," the administrator admitted, "but nothing serious. If you're interested, we can discuss details." Within a week, James scheduled a meeting at the trust's office. He drove there with a mix of nervousness and determination, knowing this could change everything. The meeting went better than he expected. The trust was indeed eager to sell, and they were willing to negotiate a reasonable price since the lake was costly to maintain. It would still be a significant investment, but James had been saving diligently for years, and he realized he could make it work. After several discussions, reviewing contracts, and consulting with a lawyer, James finally signed the papers. It took a few more weeks for everything to become official, but when it did, James Walker became the legal owner of the entire lake and the surrounding shoreline. For days, he didn't tell anyone outside his small circle of trusted neighbors. He wanted to plan his next steps carefully. The first thing he did was put up new signs around the lake, replacing the old HOA notices. The signs were simple but clear: "Private property, lake access restricted." At first, residents assumed the HOA had put up the signs. But within a few days, word started to spread. People began talking, and confusion turned into curiosity. "Did you hear?" one neighbor whispered to another while walking their dog. "The HOA didn't put up those signs. James Walker owns the lake now." The news traveled fast. By the end of the week, almost everyone in the community knew. Some were thrilled. Others were stunned. And then there were those who weren't happy at all, especially the HOA board. An emergency HOA meeting was called. The board members sat stiffly behind their long table, and the room was packed with residents eager to hear what was going on. Karen Willis, looking more composed than ever, spoke into the microphone. "We've been informed that Mr. James Walker has acquired ownership of the community lake. While the HOA is currently reviewing the legal aspects of this situation, we want to assure everyone that we are exploring options to maintain community access." From the back of the room, James stood up. "With all due respect, Karen, there's nothing to review. The HOA never owned the lake. You can't enforce rules over something you don't control." A few people in the crowd clapped quietly, while others whispered among themselves. Karen's expression tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she shifted the focus to maintaining harmony within the community. After the meeting, several residents approached James to congratulate him. Some thanked him for standing up to the HOA, while others asked if he planned to open the lake back up. James smiled and gave the same answer to everyone: "I'll make sure access is fair, but it has to be on my terms now." Privately, though, he wasn't planning to make any quick decisions. He had no intention of being petty or unfair, but he wanted to ensure that everyone understood one thing clearly: the days of the HOA controlling the lake were over. Over the next few weeks, James carefully drafted a set of rules for lake usage. He decided residents would still have access, but only if they respected the property and its upkeep. There would be no arbitrary fines, no unclear restrictions, and no special treatment for anyone. When he posted the new guidelines, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. For the first time in months, residents felt like they had a voice again. Families began coming back to the lake. Kids laughed and played along the shore. Mr. Peterson even returned with his grandson for their first fishing trip of the season. But not everyone was happy. The HOA board's influence had been diminished, and Karen Willis in particular seemed determined to find a way to regain control. James knew the tension wasn't completely gone, but for the moment, he finally felt a sense of peace. As he stood by the lake one quiet evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, James smiled to himself. The water rippled softly, reflecting shades of orange and gold. This lake, once a source of stress and conflict, had become a symbol of something bigger, standing up for what was right, protecting what mattered, and proving that patience and persistence could change everything. He had turned frustration into empowerment. And while the HOA didn't know it yet, the balance of power in lakeside estates had shifted forever. James thought buying the lake would bring peace. He imagined quiet mornings fishing without worry, kids laughing on the shore, and neighbors enjoying the view without unnecessary rules. But he quickly learned that owning the lake didn't just change his life, it shook the entire community. At first, people reacted with surprise. Some were supportive, even grateful, while others were confused or worried. Rumors spread faster than James expected. Within a few days, everyone at Lakeside Estates was talking about it. One evening, James was walking home from the grocery store when a neighbor, Mrs. Campbell, approached him with a wide smile. "James," she said excitedly, "is it true? Do you really own the lake now?" He nodded, smiling politely. "Yes, it's true." Her smile widened. "Oh, thank goodness. The HOA's been impossible these past few years. Maybe now things will finally be fair." James chuckled softly. "That's the plan." But not everyone shared Mrs. Campbell's excitement. The HOA board, especially Karen Willis, was furious. Though they couldn't control the lake anymore, they weren't ready to give up their influence without a fight. A few days later, James received a letter from the HOA. "Dear Mr. Walker, while we acknowledge your purchase of the lake, we strongly encourage you to maintain full community access. Restricting access could negatively affect property values and community relationships." James read the letter twice and smiled faintly. He knew what they were really saying. They were worried about losing control. Instead of responding, he focused on setting up his own rules. He didn't want chaos, and he certainly didn't want to be unfair. His plan was simple: create a system where residents could enjoy the lake responsibly. There would be clear guidelines, no hidden rules, and no surprise fines. After carefully drafting the rules, he printed out notices and posted them on the community bulletin boards. New lake guidelines: residents may access the lake after registering online. Fishing is allowed, but permits are required for maintenance purposes. No more HOA fines. Respect the property and keep the area clean. For many residents, this was a relief. Finally, someone was taking a logical approach. Families returned to the water, kids played near the shore, and evenings were filled with the quiet hum of people enjoying themselves. But as more residents praised James, the HOA grew increasingly frustrated. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was clear. The clubhouse was packed, and the energy in the room was different this time. People weren't there to complain about James, they were there to question the HOA. Karen Willis adjusted her microphone and began with a forced smile. "As you all know, there have been recent developments regarding lake ownership. While Mr. Walker now holds legal rights, we want to ensure that the community remains unified and that property values are protected." A man in the audience raised his hand. With all due respect, Karen, the HOA has been restricting the lake for months without reason. Mr. Walker has already given us more access than you ever did. Several people nodded in agreement, and a low murmur spread through the crowd. Karen tried to regain control. We're not here to argue. We're here to discuss how we can work together. James stood up from his seat at the back of the room and spoke calmly but firmly. I'm happy to work with anyone who wants what's best for this community, he began. But let's be clear, the HOA has no authority over the lake anymore. I own it. And I won't allow anyone to misuse it or turn it into a tool for control. The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted with whispers. Karen's polite smile faded as she replied, Mr. Walker, surely you understand the importance of maintaining harmony. If you restrict access, you risk upsetting many residents. James shook his head. I'm not restricting access. I'm setting clear rules that make sense and apply to everyone equally. There will be no favoritism, no hidden agendas, and no unexplained fines. That's more harmony than we've had in years. The crowd responded with soft claps, and a few even cheered quietly. For the first time, the HOA seemed to realize that the balance of power had shifted. After the meeting, James was approached by several residents who thanked him for standing up. One man even said, "You've done more for this community in a few weeks than the HOA has in years." Despite the growing support, James knew it wouldn't all be smooth sailing. The HOA began sending out emails, warning residents about potential risks of private lake ownership. They hinted that property values could decline and implied that James's rules might become too restrictive in the future. James, however, remained calm. He didn't respond publicly. Instead, he focused on making his ownership beneficial for everyone. He hired a small maintenance team to clean the lake regularly and installed a few benches and picnic tables along the shore. He even set up an online registration system so residents could easily book fishing times or reserve small picnic spots. Slowly, the lake transformed. It became more organized, cleaner, and safer than it had been in years. Families noticed. Residents appreciated the effort. And James earned more respect each day. But for the HOA, this only deepened the frustration. One afternoon, James received another letter from the HOA, this one marked urgent. Inside, they demanded a meeting with him to negotiate lake access. They warned that if they couldn't reach an agreement, they might pursue alternative options. James smiled faintly as he folded the letter. He knew they had no real power here, and he wasn't interested in negotiations that would give them control again. Instead, he drafted a simple public notice and posted it on the community board. The lake remains open to all residents under the new guidelines. The HOA has no authority over the property. If you have questions about access, contact me directly. It was a bold move, and it worked. Residents stopped listening to HOA rumors and started reaching out to James directly. By summer, the lake became the heart of the community again. Families gathered for weekend barbecues, neighbors planned fishing competitions, and children played along the shore without worry. It was exactly what James had envisioned when he first moved in. Still, he remained cautious. He knew the HOA wouldn't give up entirely, but he also understood something important now: knowledge and patience were powerful tools. One quiet evening, James walked to the lake with his fishing rod in hand. The air was cool, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. As he cast his line into the calm water, he smiled to himself. The lake was peaceful again, but this time, the peace wasn't fragile. It was built on clarity, fairness, and persistence. He thought back to those early days when he felt powerless against unfair rules and endless fines. Now, he stood in the very same place, stronger and in control, not because he fought loudly, but because he planned carefully and acted wisely. For James, the lake was no longer just a place to fish. It was a reminder of what patience and determination could accomplish. It showed him and everyone else that sometimes the best way to change things isn't to argue harder, but to take control of what matters most. Months had passed since James became the official owner of the lake, and the atmosphere in Lakeside Estates had changed completely. What was once a community full of whispers, arguments, and hidden tensions was now slowly finding peace. Every evening, the lake came alive again. Families gathered with picnic baskets, children played by the shore, and neighbors who had barely spoken before now greeted each other warmly. The sound of laughter and soft conversation filled the air where once there had been silence and resentment. James often sat on a wooden bench near the water, watching the ripples shimmer under the sunlight. He smiled quietly to himself, knowing how much effort it had taken to reach this point. It hadn't been easy. Taking ownership of the lake had created a storm of opinions and emotions. Some people celebrated his decision, while others doubted his intentions at first. And then there was the HOA, which had tried everything it could to hold onto its control. But over time, actions spoke louder than arguments. James's approach to managing the lake was simple and fair. He didn't create unnecessary rules or surprise fines. Instead, he focused on transparency. He shared updates openly with residents, invited their feedback, and even set up a small committee to help maintain the lake area. For the first time, people felt involved. Mr. Peterson, who once feared he'd never fish with his grandson again, now visited the lake almost every weekend. Sarah and David often brought their friends for evening walks, and Mrs. Campbell started organizing small community gatherings by the shore. One Saturday, James stood by the water as a group of children splashed and laughed nearby. A young boy ran up to him, holding a small fish proudly in his hands. "Mr. Walker, look," the boy said, beaming. "I caught one." James chuckled warmly. "That's a good one, Tommy. Make sure you put him back gently, all right." The boy nodded and hurried back to the water. Moments like this made everything worth it. But behind the scenes, the HOA still hadn't fully accepted the new reality. Karen Willis and the board members had continued holding meetings, hoping to regain influence. They sent letters to residents warning about long-term risks, hosted discussions about community value, and even hinted at possible legal actions. Yet as weeks turned into months, their efforts lost momentum. People weren't interested in old arguments anymore. They saw the lake thriving, they saw families happy, and they trusted James's intentions. The more they enjoyed their regained freedom, the less they cared about the HOA's warnings. One day, Karen herself approached James by the lake. She walked slowly, holding a folder in her hands, her usual confident expression replaced by something softer. "Mr. Walker," she began, stopping a few feet away. "Karen," James greeted her calmly. "What can I do for you?" She hesitated before speaking again. "I wanted to apologize." James raised an eyebrow, surprised but silent. She took a deep breath. "When this all started, the board thought we were protecting the community. We believed restricting fishing would help preserve the lake, but we went about it the wrong way. We didn't communicate properly. We caused tension instead of solving problems." James studied her for a moment. He could tell the words weren't easy for her to say. "I appreciate you saying that," he replied gently. "But this was never about control for me. It was about fairness. People just wanted to enjoy what they were promised when they bought their homes." Karen nodded slowly. "I see that now." For the first time, there was no argument, no defensiveness, just understanding. A few weeks later, the HOA officially stepped back from any involvement with the lake. They issued a statement acknowledging that it was privately owned and that residents should follow the new guidelines set by James. It was the closest thing to a truce the community had seen in years. With tensions finally settled, Lakeside Estates began to thrive in ways no one expected. James launched a few small projects to make the lake area even better. He built wooden walkways along the shoreline, added shaded benches for families, and even worked with a local gardening club to plant flowers and shrubs around the paths. The once neglected lake area transformed into a beautiful, welcoming space for everyone. One evening, the community gathered for a small celebration, the first official lakeside festival. Residents brought homemade dishes, kids played games, and a local musician performed near the water. Strings of lights glimmered around the shore, reflecting on the calm surface of the lake. As James walked among the crowd, people stopped to thank him, some shaking his hand, others giving warm smiles. "You've done something special here," Mrs. Campbell said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. James smiled modestly. "I just wanted everyone to have a fair chance to enjoy this place." Later that night, as the festival wound down, James found himself sitting on the pier, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of families packing up. He thought back to where it all began that first fine, the frustrating meetings, the feeling of being treated unfairly. At the time, it had felt like such a heavy burden, but now, looking around, he realized how much good had come out of it. Sometimes challenges lead to unexpected opportunities. By standing up for himself, he'd also stood up for his neighbors. By choosing patience and persistence over anger, he'd gained something far more valuable than ownership. He'd earned the community's trust and respect. The lake had become more than just water and land. It was now a symbol of cooperation and fairness, a reminder of what could happen when someone refused to give up on doing the right thing. As the moonlight reflected on the rippling water, James felt a deep sense of peace. He had reclaimed his favorite place, but more importantly, he had helped give the entire neighborhood something they could all be proud of. The HOA's influence had faded, but James bore no grudges. He had no interest in revenge or holding power over anyone. His only goal had been to restore balance, and now, at last, it felt like he'd succeeded. From that day on, the lake became the heart of Lakeside Estates. Every season brought something new: spring picnics under blooming flowers, summer evenings filled with fishing and laughter, autumn festivals with warm food and music, and winter walks along quiet, frost-covered paths. Neighbors who once barely spoke now waved to each other warmly. Families shared recipes at community events, and children grew up with fond memories by the water. For James, that was the true victory. One morning, as he stood by the lake with his fishing rod, Tommy, the little boy from before, came running up again. "Mr. Walker," Tommy said breathlessly, "my dad says you're the reason we get to fish here." "Thank you." James smiled and patted the boy's shoulder. "You're welcome, Tommy. Just promise me one thing: always take care of this place." "I will," Tommy said with a grin before dashing back to his friends. James watched him go, feeling both proud and humbled. He knew that one day, long after he'd moved on, the lake would still be here, offering the same peace and joy to future families. And that was enough.